we will be discussing Beyond Business, Upholding Dignity in Catholic Universities. Our host for the evening will be Maggie Fergusson, who's the Deputy Editor of The Tablet, and she will be hosting an expert panel of guests to discuss Pope Francis's statement and its impact on Catholic universities around the world. Many thanks again to all of you speakers for joining us. This event is sponsored by Notre University in Australia. Without further ado, I shall pass you over to our host, Maggie Fergusson. Good evening, Maggie.
Good evening, thank you very much. And good evening to all our speakers, to Dame Helen Ghosh, to Dr. Maureen Glackin, to Professor Thomas O'Loughlin, I hope I've pronounced that right, and Professor Renee Kohler-Ryan, who is joining us from Australia. So it's like 3 a.m. or something, her time. So we'll try not to make things too difficult for her. I wondered whether each of you could just introduce yourselves, say what your experience has been, if any, of Catholic universities, and what you think a Catholic university actually is. So should we start with Renee?
Thank you, Maggie. My experience of Catholic universities has been a little bit diverse, I suppose. I have my PhD from the Catholic University of Leuven, so from one of the big old Catholic universities in Belgium. And that has been a very different experience from being at my University of Notre Dame, Australia, which is a national university, so not just within one beautiful town in Belgium with all of the centuries old buildings and all of the customs and traditions, but then in Australia in a university that spans both coasts of the country, founded in Western Australia by lay people in the 20th century, and then with campuses in Broome, which is a remote part of Western Australia and that campus really serves very much the local population there in a very isolated area. And then in Sydney, we have a campus as well, which is where I'm based. I've had a lot to do with other Catholic universities through various partnerships. And what I have always appreciated about Catholic universities is that whether you are at Leuven or whether you're in here in Australia, or whether you go to Catholic universities in the UK or any other parts of the world, there's a certain sense of familiarity. And I think that comes from a shared vision of what education is, that education is something that's formative, and that we're dealing with beautiful human beings who are made in the image and likeness of God, and who are really created to try to find what's true and good and beautiful. That education has an integrative function. We talk a lot about the public good that universities bring about. That happens quite often, speaking in Australia, in a climate that's not really sure about what tertiary education is about. Catholic universities have never had an issue of understanding what they are about. And that has to do with really their vision of being made for something greater, and of knowing that humans are made to know and to form communities together, and to really contribute as much as they can to society around them.
That's lovely. That makes me want to go straight to a Catholic university. Helen.
Thank you. Well, I'm very much the amateur on this panel in terms of understanding the theology and practice behind Catholic universities. I have been working at Oxford University as head of Balliol College for 6 years. And of course, now Oxford University is not a Catholic university, though I always love the fact that our motto is Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is my light. And that reminds us that we were once a Catholic university. In prep for this event, I read the excellent article about Francis Campbell, now, of course, in Australia, talking about his life, but also talking about what he believes a Catholic university to be. And he said his definition was that it's not so much how many Catholics you have, it's an articulation of an ethos and an identity. So I started thinking about how a secular though very religious in its foundation, and certainly in the foundation documents of many of the colleges, how a secular university might meet some of these criteria. So how does that ethos and identity work here? Again, he quoted, I think, Vincent Nichols speaking at St. Mary's, saying that the Catholic identity of St. Mary's is its point of openness rather than closedness to the world, which I think is a broader and wonderful definition of Catholicism as well. And of course, we as a university, like almost all UK universities now, are increasingly international. We have, although 80% of our undergraduates are UK students, 20% are international. For our postgraduate students, 80% are international and 20% are UK citizens. And that brings in a wonderful diversity and openness to the world. And of course, reflected in the fact that our student population are of many faiths and none. I think there is an interesting challenge which we might come on to later as to the extent to which our college being founded in 1263, religion is one of our charitable purposes, and we have a chaplain and we have a chapel. And we were discussing only recently the appointment of a new chaplain. And the secularists said, but, you know, young people today, they are not people of faith. And we pointed out, we probably have more people of faith, some kind of faith, in our student population now than we have ever had because of our internationalism and diversity. Francis also talked about a commitment to the truth, seeking the truth, and an openness to dialogue and engagement. UK universities are very much caught up in culture wars and debates about freedom of expression. And this university and all of the constituent colleges have a real commitment to freedom of expression. It's the lifeblood of the university, as our university says, and it helps us approach truth. It enables the pursuit of knowledge. So we might come back to that. And finally, Francis also cites that wonderful text, the idea of a university as a place where people come together to find solutions or meaning in what they're experiencing together. And although we are, in one sense, not a religious institution, in Balliol College, we have an annual St. Catherine's Day feast, St. Catherine being the patron saint of our foundress, who is the wife of John de Balliol in the 13th century. I start off having to explain to the students what a saint is, because, you know, the audience may not know what a saint is. And I then explain that we have local saints, one of them being St. John Henry Newman. And I will end by, I quoted to them an extract from the idea of a university. When a multitude of young people, keen, open-hearted, sympathetic and observant as young people are, come together and freely mix with each other, they're sure to learn from one another. The conversation of all is a series of lectures to each, and they gain for themselves new ideas and views, fresh matter of thought, and distinct principles for judging and acting day by day. So I feel as a university, I was having explored these themes, I concluded that perhaps we are more of a Catholic university than I thought.
Interesting. Just quickly before we move on, Helen, would you are you sort of aware of who in your student body is Catholic?
Yes, sorry, of course, to some extent. The as some of you will know, clearly we're served by a wonderful Roman Catholic chaplaincy, long established, with very distinguished chaplains in the past. Now, Father Damien Howard, SJ, former head of the Jesuits in the UK. And in fact, although there is a very wide range of other Catholic choices for students across the city of all kinds of church personship, you can tell from that approximately what the Catholic population of the university may be. In our college, we have a regular termly Catholic Mass in our chapel. And so I see, you know, a dozen or so students come to that. So I do have some idea, yes.
Interesting. Maureen.
Thank you. Well, I worked at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, or known to very many people as Strawberry Hill, which and I ended up running the Faculty of Education and Theology there. So I came in, I had done a master's at Heathrop whilst working in education as a teacher, and then wanted to do a PhD. So took myself to St Mary's to do that, and then started to work there on their part of their teacher education program. So as a primary RE lecturer. And so I think there's a very interesting take to be had, particularly on some of who we're discussing what we term the Catholic universities in this country, which we would say are Newman, Liverpool Hope, St Mary's and Leeds Trinity, which have really grown up from a pastoral engagement with the world. I mean, look at what Pope Francis said about, building, helping the church in her mission. I think those institutions, having grown from teacher training colleges now into universities, have certainly been real symbols of that mission within this country. And if I think about the number of teachers that they have trained and how many pupils those teachers have gone on to teach, and the influence they have had across Catholic education, I think we could certainly say that those institutions are very great missionaries of the church in the world. However, I think it's also right, so that they're not, we're not part, in this country, they're not part of the intellectual elite. In that sense, we're not part of Russell Group, and actually a research function within those foundations, which is obviously so important to the life of the university. Has only latterly developed, I would say, and it's more advanced in some institutions than others. But I do think that it's, in terms of mission integrity and of the church in the world, I think these institutions are very, very forward facing. And from my own thing, what do I think a Catholic university means for me? I think it's somewhere that is countercultural. I would expect a robust theology department, whether that is scriptural theology or indeed in the St Mary's tradition, pastoral theology, a place where society is held to account, where people ask questions. I mean, I'm thinking at the moment around the debate around assisted suicide, and I think our Catholic universities have a particular voice there, and a very powerful one, and as I said, countercultural. And I think there is an increasing place for that Catholic voice within public life. And so, while the way the demographic of our institutions is changing no more than within our schools, it is that inclusive ethos. It is that understanding that there are things that we do here in this way because of who we are, and this is our foundation, and it's not something that we're embarrassed by or ashamed of. It is something that we confidently own and build upon that foundation in articulating what a Catholic identity means in contemporary society. And whether you're a sports, I know for some pupils being within that institution, the fact that it's Catholic is part of the kind of the backstory for them. But our church is in the middle of the campus at St Mary's. The chaplain's office is also in the middle of the campus, and I think there's great witness in that. So yes, a countercultural institution, but I think particularly in my experience of working within one that makes and continues to make a vital contribution to the mission of the church, rooted in the world.
Tom.
Well, I'm a historical theologian, and I've spent most of my career working on the early Latin Middle Ages and theology written in Latin. And recently I've been working on a book on the evolution of the Eucharist in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So I'm sort of going away from historically where I have spent most of my life. My first theology degree was from St Patrick's College, Maynooth, and it's branded in the name of the Pope. It's a pontifical degree. And I spent, I can't do the arithmetic in my head, teaching in the Milltown Institute for Philosophy and Theology and Philosophy, which alas is no longer with us in Dublin, which was a pontifical faculty. But I've spent the last nearly 30 years in secular universities, and I'm the Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology in the University of Nottingham. my other contact with Catholic universities down the years is that, of course, I've been the examiner. I've examined in St. Mary's and other Liverpool Hope and places like that. And I've been always interested in the juxtaposition of the word university and Catholic. And I'm very conscious that for many outside the Catholic world, and for many in the theology world outside the denominational world, there is a suspicion of any institution that is linked to a particular religious tradition, because one looks at certain examples from the United States where a church university is really a decision: we don't like what's happening in the world and we're going to just paddle our own canoe however you like it or not. And I think there is a suspicion that if you associate the word university with Catholic, that it's somehow a lagering of the wagons. And I think that's something that Catholic universities have to be very worried about. But equally, we have to be aware that Christianity is fundamentally a knowledge-seeking religion. We invented the idea of a university. Dame Helen proudly told us of 1263, but one could go 100 years earlier and look at the School of Paris, and then the work of the Archbishop of Paris and founding the university in 1209. But one could go back to the monasteries. And it is of the nature of Christianity to investigate reality with all the rigor it can muster. And of course, the great glory of medieval Catholic theology, and indeed the people who founded an institution like Balliol College, was that they were going to follow the truth wherever it led. So Aquinas sees the truth as inherently one, and is always suspicious of the idea that there is a particular truth, because that might be juxtaposed to what one could discover somewhere else. So we are the inheritors of a very rich legacy of searching diligently and using all our critical faculties. And I think we have to emphasize that notion of that it is the critical pursuit of truth, because so many people associate the religious pursuit of truth as either a laggard wagons, we're just going to look at our own thing, or the mere repetition of a party line in the face of the evidence.
Very good. So I was reminded recently of something that Timothy Radcliffe, who's in Oxford with Helen, wrote a couple of years ago in the tablet. He said that the challenge for Catholics is to weigh up the convictions of the church against the questions of the world. And that can't be true for anybody more than for people of a sort of undergraduate age. How do you have, Renee, a particular way of dealing with that problem in a Catholic university, in a Catholic context?
Thank you, Maggie. And Thomas, I really like the way that you drew this to our attention, that Catholics invented universities, which is something I often say to my students. Why is it that Catholics...
Let's be precise. Western Christians invented universities.
Yes.
Western Christians, yeah. But why is it that we're invested in universities and also in a health system? So because we have so many students studying for those professions when we come through the university. Maggie, the way that I approach what you've named there is that I think that it's incumbent upon those who are teaching within Catholic universities to present the full range of views on any given topic. So I'm a philosopher by training, and one of the things that we do as philosophers is, if we're doing our jobs well, is to look at all of the different arguments for and against a position before really landing on what it is that we ourselves want to stand up for. And what I find when speaking to my students is that they're sometimes very surprised by this. So I've had full-on arguments with students where we might be discussing very contentious issues. I still remember the look of horror on a young woman's face when we were having a discussion about abortion one day in class, and we were really arguing back and forth. And I was really presenting the position for abortion from a philosophical perspective so that she would appreciate just how strong all of the different positions are. And at a certain point, she looked at me as though, oh my gosh, I cannot believe you're saying this. And I said, yes, but it's my job to do that. I have to actually give you, you know, the full-on argument from the other perspective. It doesn't mean that I believe in this, but you need to know that there is a reasonable argument from a completely different point of view. So I think that that's very important within a Catholic university, that we don't have sort of straw men arguments about some of these really contentious issues, but then instead we look at them in their fullness, and that we always make sure that we give the full range of arguments, including the Catholic understanding. So that's something else that I've had students at the university say. Firstly, and this I find always exhilarating when it happens, that they've never felt so free in a classroom in a Catholic university to discuss anything at all as they have anywhere else. And also, we've had students come to us.
These might be non-Catholic students.
Yes, there might be non-Catholic students, or there might be Catholic students who have gone through the full sort of, you know, primary and secondary education. During which sometimes they've been told, oh no, you can't talk about that kind of thing in a Catholic school. So sort of that there are topics that are off limits. Yeah. So they find it really refreshing that they can bring up anything and talk about it, sort of ventilate any ideas. And the other thing is that we make sure that when we teach the history of philosophy, for instance, that we don't leave out major gap. There aren't major gaps. So in a lot of Australian Catholic universities, they'll refuse to teach medieval philosophy because medieval philosophers talk too much about God. And from an atheistic perspective, then you just say, well, that's not really proper philosophy. So we're not going to, you know, talk about Thomas Aquinas. So you end up with about 1,000 years of thought missing in the history of philosophy. So those are some of, from my experience of working in a Catholic university, I've just found it extremely freeing, and the students have responded to that freedom.
Helen, what do you think? Because it seems to me, I mean, there were difficult questions to contend with when I was at Oxford very many years ago, but it terrifies me now what I mean, I've been reporting for the Tablet on the Cass review, and just what young people are facing, and if they're trying to balance that with religious conviction, how does that work?
Well, I think that is a very, very good question. I think there's always, I in fact was going to phrase a similar question to Renee. When I talk to students in my college, and obviously that's my main source of information on this, what I think is reassuring in many ways. So, for example, we recently had, I don't know whether it would have reached you, Renee, in Australia, but there was an academic from the University of Sussex called Kathleen Stock, who has, and I'm always going to get the terminology wrong because it's so confusing, but basically has a biologically based view of sex and gender, rather like of a J.K. Rowling-ish kind. And she was invited, not by the university, but by the Oxford Union, which, as you all know, is a quite independent debating society, to come and express her views. So there were lots of criticisms in the various press and the media among students. There were demonstrations outside. The university tried to keep its distance, i.e. it wasn't their event, but inevitably got sucked into the debate. When I spoke to my, as it happened, female JCR and MCR middle common room, graduate and undergraduate common rooms, and I said, you know, what do you think about what Kathleen Stock said? And I was betraying myself as a second generation feminist. I said, it seems to me actually quite reasonable. And they said, actually, most of us think it's quite reasonable. You've got that silent majority in the middle who I think, do just carry on with life. Not that they're afraid to express views, but in a sense, they feel it's irrelevant to their other concerns. The argument that, of course, is put on freedom of speech is not so much that intellectual argument, the argument that the university would put about why freedom of speech is our lifeblood. It's very often posed in terms of a feeling of safety. It makes me not feel safe that there should be people who, for example, are either against or indeed for abortion. It's framed in a way that is not intellectual, but is almost emotional. And I was going to say, when Renee was speaking, I feel like rushing over to Australia and join more philosophy classes. But do you get that I don't feel safe? I don't feel safe if you invite that person to speak, which is very, very difficult to counter. I mean, we do counter it, but it's a different angle on the same issue.
Yes, Helen, it is really difficult, isn't it? Because there's a lot more recourse to feeling than to reason.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that I think is really important for Catholic universities, to insist on the use of reason and to see that reason needs to be integrated with feeling, and we need to really interrogate our feelings, but not be victims of our feelings.
Right.
So it's one thing to appreciate that you're dealing with a very contentious, sensitive issue, and there are people who will be responding quite strongly to that, and we need to always be sensitive to this, but not at the risk of shutting down debates. And that's a really difficult thing for any university to balance. So like other universities around the world, in Australia, we have all sorts of protests happening on campus, deplatforming people, saying, no, we don't like what this person has to say, and therefore they cannot speak. That seems to me to be completely counter to what a university should be doing. And that frightens me, the idea that because I don't agree with someone that they shouldn't be allowed to speak at all. I think that's highly problematic for a university. It's interesting, isn't it, that young people, we sometimes expect that they must be thinking in one way, but then, like the students you were talking to,
They weren't.
They come back, they say, well, no, actually.
But you don't hear them. You don't hear them in the great noise that goes on above their heads.
That's right.
Heads. Yeah.
That's right. And there can be an inordinate amount of noise about some of these big sort of hot button issues. But when you actually dig down deeper and take away the noise, there's a strong, a really solid conversation to be had that is, that helps young people to see what's going on in the world and what their views are and how they might want to express those views.
Yeah.
Maureen, what's your experience of young people tussling between the convictions of the church and the challenges of the world?
Well, it's interesting because I think having taught for the main on teacher training programs, which are very particularly stratified, they are very, very full on. I think what we've managed to do is really give an additional pastoral presence to students, so that when I would hope that they felt comfortable discussing. When I was lecturing in RE, I would, students would come in feeling that they had nothing to learn here. And of course, by statute, it's the one subject that must be taught in schools here. It's a statutory requirement to teach RE in all schools. So once you gave them the law, and then you began to unpick their own inherent prejudices towards religions, but most specifically towards elements of Christianity, and very specifically towards Catholicism, you then often got opportunities to have very deep conversations with students, and very privileged conversations, and perhaps guide them into other areas of the university where they would get some support and some confidentiality discussing those issues. But I think it was in a very different context in one sense. But I think Catholic universities as safe and open spaces for that type of conversation is absolutely critical, as you say, at a time when debate is so often being closed down.
Yeah.
And you can be very unfashionable in holding a view. And it's quite interesting often when students would go out into schools. One of the schools we worked at, there were a very high proportion of Plymouth Brethren students in the school. And that was also quite interesting for student teachers because, of course, they wouldn't take part, particularly if they were on placement over the Christmas term. That particular group of students would not participate in anything to do with Christmas, with the Nativity, with any element of school, also around ICT and the use of computers. So it was quite interesting to see another, a very conservative group within that broad Christian panoply, and how schools coped with that, and how schools ensured that they were as inclusive as they could be without compromising the dignity of those pupils and their parents' wishes. So I think that it's interesting listening to Renee talking about her philosophy classes. Yeah, I wish I was in them too. And it does make me think as well, so much of what we did within teacher education was so reductionist in a way, just because of the nature, the politicized nature of education and learning, I think, in this country. And we were constantly saying, free yourselves, don't be afraid, take that step, be confident. If it goes wrong, you will learn from it, as you say to your pupils. But giving them a safe space within which to experiment, in which to test ideas and thoughts, in a practical sense, in a pedagogical sense, in a way for the many of the students I worked with, as well as in your sense, Renee and Helen, in an intellectual sense. So it's interesting for me in that pastorally and that practically focused program, how the themes are the same, but perhaps how they're expressed and realized is in a different methodology.
Yeah. Can I just remind everybody who's listening in that this event is sponsored by Notre Dame University in Australia. And Tom, over to you on this question.
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental challenges facing a university teacher is to try and help the student discover the reasons for what they think they know and what they think they believe. And that faces two enormous barriers. The first one is the obvious one, that it's painful to try and reason out where one is and how one has got there and what one might actually think. We don't like doing it. We're not naturally good at being reflective. The second element is that there's always nicer things to do. And and this is whether it's a Catholic university or an ordinary university or whatever, and that is, will this come up on the exam, the strategic learner? And there's a variant on the strategic learner now, which says that the skill of knowing anything is that I can express it in a short soundbite or put it on X. But that's again strategic learning. And of course, the problem with trying to know what I actually know and finding out what I really believe is a long-handed problem. It requires lots of slow learned work. Now, one of the differences between doing that as an ordinary, in inverted commas, university teacher, and by the way, I've had to do it with PhD students. It's not something that you get over in the first year or even in the first degree. You'll find someone who's actually decided they're going to devote 4 years of intense research, and they haven't a clue why they're doing it. But that if you are a Christian and you're engaged in that work, it is not merely a job, but it's actually part of your own religious vocation and your own search for the truth, that you're helping someone else come to this level of self-awareness. And of course, it presupposes that you're engaging it constantly yourself, because knowing yourself is not something that, you need to write letters to your younger self saying, oh, you were such an idiot.
I went to give a talk in a Catholic school in Ealing last week, and I discovered that I think 40% of their students are Catholic and the rest not. And I said to the headmaster, what happens when the Catholic ones are going to Mass? And he said, oh no, they all go to Mass. They all. Renee, you're probably best placed to tell us whether that is what happens in a Catholic university. The non-Catholic students are actually expected to join in the Catholic life.
So there isn't the expectation that they'll all be going to Mass.
Yeah.
And in fact, we have students who are Catholic, we have students who are of other religions, of no religion, those who are looking, I mean, really, they reflect the demographic of the nation in this way. And we'd have a lot of Catholics who are simply not practicing. So I think that one of the things that a Catholic university can do is through intellectual inquiry. So we have a core curriculum at the university where all of the students are really exposed to the Catholic intellectual tradition and philosophy and theology. It's sort of the foundations of our tradition. And we try to make that quite invitational so that it's not that we're saying, well, this is the way it is and you'd better toe the line, but instead, getting them to really delve into questions of purpose in their lives, of questions about God, etc. So what does it look like, I suppose? How is another way of putting it, Maggie?
I think what it looks
how
like
is it
is exactly what I'm getting at. Yeah, if you give us an idea of what does it actually mean to be in a Catholic university, because Tom was just suggesting how you search for the truth in a university, full stop, but there's something more going on.
Yeah, and that's like the X factor, isn't it? What is the something more? So it's something about the way that sort of our physical infrastructure is. I think it should reflect its Catholic heritage. So through artworks, through trying to create beautiful spaces where students really come together and mingle, or the whole community comes together. We have lots of courtyards through chance and design at Notre Dame. So there are these outside spaces that often remind me of a cloister. So there's the sort of that repetition of a historical precedent, but it means that there are constantly places where people gather together to speak, to enjoy each other's company, etc. On the Sydney campus, we have a beautiful church that's quite prominent on the campus. And I think that is just sort of a physical reminder that this is a Catholic campus. We have across the university a cross made out of jarrah wood, which is this wood that's native to Western Australia, to remind us of our origins historically, but also there's just that constant reminder that we're in a Christian place. And we also have the objects of the university, which talk about the fact that we are a university that offers education within the context of Catholic faith and values. And I think that what's probably really important and what it looks like within a Catholic university to be Catholic is to keep alive the question of what that looks like in every area of our work.
Right.
And it probably, it doesn't change fundamentally, but its expression changes depending on what the activity of the university is, whether it's teaching, whether it's research, whether it's administration, but also what the burning questions of the day are, which Helen has raised. Gender is just one of the burning questions of the day, or what's going on politically. Even, we have questions about cost of living these days that are going on, I think, everywhere. So how is it that a university responds to those? And that can have to do very much with an approach that's quite holistic. I think that that's very Catholic. So looking at questions from all different angles and trying to appreciate how they impact on the lives of humans. To keep that vision of the dignity of the human person alive, which is, I think, what we're looking at today.
So
can I just pick up what Renee was saying? I'm picking up the word dignity in the title of this seminar. The other thing I was thinking about was the extent to which we are able, I mean, certainly in the UK, given the disastrous way in which universities are financed and the straits to which many universities that don't have underlying resources, as this university does, particularly in the colleges, you would have thought that a Catholic university would also be quite distinctive, if it could afford to be, in terms of the pastoral care it gave its students. That sense that, you know, of the dignity of the individual and so on. You would kind of hope that that would be the case. As I say, and I don't know how things work in Australia, and Maureen and Tom may have different experiences, but I know, you know, as a university, Oxford, and in particular the colleges, we are very privileged in that we do have enough resource beyond the income we don't get from particularly our UK students to supplement the kinds of welfare and well-being and other activities and the cultural things that our students do. But many universities in the UK, you know, they have to take large numbers of students who they have to teach in large classes. They have, in many cases, to take international students to whom they can charge higher fees. It's not factory farming exactly, but it's not got that kind of space or indeed resource within it to really focus on that individual dignity. And I kind of would hope that Catholic universities had the resource to be distinctive in that sense. I don't know how, Renee, you probably have a rational system of university finance in Australia, but Maureen and Tom may recognise what I say.
Oh no, I think we share the pain, Helen. One of our objects at the university is pastoral care, so offering excellent pastoral care though, and we have a sort of live conversation about what that looks like. I think probably everyone here, so Maureen and Thomas, you and Helen, you would all sort of know what that looks like. But again, I actually think that it comes from a vision of humanity.
Yeah.
So if everyone can share that vision, then pastoral care should naturally flow from that. So if you're looking at the student in front of you and your colleagues, not in a corporate sense and not as a commodity. So we're not producing things, we're forming humans.
Formation. Yeah.
Exactly. And ours is a small contribution to that, because really it's their relationship with others, which we're facilitating. Their relationship with the truth, their relationship with God through the truth, etc., which we're facilitating in education, but we're not producing something.
I'd like to come in there because to go back to our title, it's Beyond Business. We could ask, what would a non-Catholic or a non-Christian university look like?
That's exactly what. Well, I was going to say. I mean, when the Pope spoke recently for the anniversary of the Federation of Catholic Universities, what he said was, at a time of great fragmentation, we must dare to counter the trend and to globalize hope, unity, and concord in place of indifference, polarization, and conflict. But what struck me is that I would think that's what everybody's trying to do.
Yeah.
When you talk about, is that not what you're trying to do?
It is, but you see, the reality is there are universities, and there are several of them in Britain, which have commodified knowledge. There are places which teach business studies. There are places which teach legal studies. There are places which teach parts of the engineering curriculum. And they make no bones about it. There's no frills, no formation, no nothing. You come in, you're stuffed with the right facts. It's the old Cramer model. And the danger with that is it is very attractive to our students, because Dame Helen will know, students come up and say, I've paid £9,600. Am I getting value for money?
Yes.
And parents will tell you, and they're encouraged by politicians, I can't remember the clown who said it, but he was going to make sure that students were in the room at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and they were going to be lectured till 5 o'clock on a Friday evening. And of course, this is what the Cramer universities, what I'd call the non-Christian universities, do, because we have to be very careful that ultimately we are pursuing research to lead to truth. We're not there. We pursue truth, and then we teach our students. We don't teach our students, and then on the sidelines of that, do a little bit of research as boffins. That's what separates us from the technical school, and it's what separates us from the teacher in the secondary school. And we are in, I'm sure, I don't know whether Helen would agree with me, there are very strong cultural forces in our society that say, just get them in, make sure they got all the info, get value for money, and leave satisfied customers. And then if you've done that, you've done your job. But, you're primarily a scholar who then shares your knowledge with students. And if we don't remember that, we will just end up producing mechanics.
Maureen, you look as if you're wanting to come in here. Yeah.
Well, it's not solely in the universities. I believe we have a very reductionist curriculum in our schools, which is politically driven, and so we have our university students come to us from our schools with that commoditization package mentality in their minds, and it is about, I'm giving you 9,250. I remember a student saying to me, but I'm paying you, and I said, you're not paying me for a better mark. I said, you can buy a degree on the internet far more cheaply than the 9,250 you're giving me for this year. It is about opening your mind, and you will see in my marking that I've shown you how you can get better, how you can, in your next submission, produce an even better piece of work. So that's what you are paying me for. You're paying me to tell you the truth as I see it about this piece of work. So we have students whose minds are not opened, and as in that wonderful word around, formation, teaching, nurturing our students into an understanding that is what these years are about. And if you open your mind and challenge your own thinking and critique what you have seen as perceived truths or inherited truths, then you will leave this in a stronger place with a fine questioning mind, which will allow you to be countercultural, to think, do I swim with the tide, or actually on this one, do I swim against it? And it's even more critical now, but it is increasingly difficult, as you say, because it is what is the business of universities. If a member of staff retires or resigns, can I appoint another full-time member of staff to replace? Potentially, but only if I have enough 9,250s. If I don't have enough bottoms on seats, then I can't replace like for like. So then if I can't, I'm then thinking, well, how can I do this with integrity without losing too much? But I'm going to need to model it in a different way. And I think that pressure, I'm not saying that shouldn't be there, because from, necessity is the mother of some great inventions, but it is that balance of market and mission. Which is endemic in Catholic education at all levels, but is really critical at HE level, at university level, I think.
Yeah. I mean, just to pick up Tom's question, I think even in a university, and I imagine this is also true across the Russell Group universities, there is an element of it's becoming more like a customer-facing service. And sadly, our politicians in the United Kingdom reinforce that. They cease to give us grants for doing what they regard as pointless subjects, like the history of art or music or something. And they say, essentially, they will support subjects which are, as you describe it, Tom, training people with facts to do a particular job and have an economic purpose to them. It's wonderful to hear our sadly about to retire Chancellor Chris Patten, of course, obviously a former Tablet trustee, I think, say we're not here to do that. What we're here to do is to teach people to think, not what to think, and the power of critical thinking about whatever it may be. And this comes back to I think what Renee was saying about what a Catholic university is trying to do is the most important thing of all that we can do, because I certainly say, and to my students here, but also broadly in the university, we are shaping the society of tomorrow. We're maybe doing brilliant research, as you say, Tom, and discovering vaccines for this, that, and the other, but we're also creating the people who go off to be the creative artists, the lawyers, and that they are tomorrow's society, and we forget that at our peril, and successive governments forget that too, I think.
Well, that's very good, because I think you've answered really the question that's come up on the sidebar, which is how can a university show that they're more than a business, given the cost of actually sending a student through a university in the UK. We're kind of running out of time, but I wanted to ask each of you whether, perhaps we'll start with Tom this time, whether you could say what you feel would be the hallmarks of a student graduating from a Catholic university, or should be the hallmarks.
I would like that student to be a critical engager in society. If they are belonging to a religion, I would want them to be able to explore that religion with the freedom and skills that they've learned in their degree scheme. If they're a Christian or a Catholic, I would want them to see this as part of their vocation. And I would hope they'd have a sense that the intellectual life is as much part of being a Christian as prayer life or the works of discipleship or the works of charity. And the last thing I would like them to have is, I would like to feel that they have been enriched by the experience of learning, even if they're in a very poorly paid job.
Helen.
Heavens, I was hoping you were going to come to me last. As Tom rightly said, we may have Catholics who emerge from Catholic universities, but yes, I think I would want them to have all the qualities that Tom described, and indeed that Chris Patton described: how to think, critical thinking. I'd want them to have learnt something in the university, we've spoken about it briefly, about how to create a community. They will have seen, we hope, a community of some kind created in a college, in a university, whether it's in Australia or Twickenham or wherever it may be. I hope that what they would see is an example of a well-functioning community and how people within that community relate to each other and support each other to choose whatever lives that they want to choose. So I think I would add those intellectual qualities to that sense of community.
Maureen.
I'd want them to be confident. I'd want them to understand the significance of the balance between what Pope Francis calls the language of the heart, the language of the hand, the language of the mind, and that the spirit, mind, and body need to be tended if one is to experience life and experience it to the full. So to give attention to that inner reflection, to give attention to what you do, and not only what you do, but how you do it, but also not to shy away from the challenge of the intellectual discourse, to be thinkers and questioners all the time.
Renee.
Maggie, I'd like to pick up on something that I've heard just in the contributions of the panelists just now, which is that I think what I would like is for all of our graduates to be very confident, in the right kinds of ways. So, Christ says throughout the Gospels, and this is something that John Paul II picked up, be not afraid. There's a lot of fear out there in our society today, and I think that Catholic universities have something to contribute in helping their future graduates to really not be afraid of asking questions, not be afraid of the variety of different answers that they might receive. There should be a kind of kindling of the imagination and the intellect in such a way that they realize that their first degree, which may be their only university degree, but indeed their university education is the beginning of something rather than the end of something. So it's not just coming out with a qual, but it's a signifier that something has been sparked and that they're going to be able to carry that spark into the world in some way. Newman has a beautiful quote, which I wish that I had my idea of the university next to me. It's in my office right now. Obviously, this means I need to get another copy, but there's a for at home. But there's a passage in there where he actually describes what he thinks that a graduate should look like, and it's someone who is confident, someone who can mix with any kind of any class of society could talk with a king or a pauper, if you want to put it in those terrible old terms, and be able to do so in such a way that there's such a focus on the humanity of the person that they're engaging with, that social class doesn't matter at all. So it's this kind of vision of humanity that comes through. They're well informed, but not arrogant, articulate, and and gregarious, and have a beautiful sense of proportion, which means that they have a lovely sense of humor. And there's sort of all of these different qualities that I think sort of lend themselves to a bit of a vision of what we have, of what I hope that in the best conversations within university, it's kind of like a little glimpse of what it might be like in heaven when we're all merrily together, enjoying what it means to be fully human.
That's so lovely.
That's one. I must look for this quotation and use it at degree ceremonies to send.
I'll try to find it, Helen, and send it to
into the world.
Wonderful. We've got like 1 minute left. And Renee, sorry, I wanted to come back to you again, and it's not that I want to end on a down note. I'm just interested in the answer to this question. If a student came to you and said, I am thinking about coming to Notre Dame, be honest with me, what are the drawbacks of being at a Catholic university? What's the answer to that?
Oh, I don't know that there are any drawbacks, Maggie. I suppose it might only be a drawback in perception. Some people might think that because you're going to a Catholic university, certain questions would be closed to you. But I think we've established within this discussion that the opposite is the case.
Great, fantastic. Well, I think